At 10:47 a.m. on December 7, 1944, the war in Europe had stalled in the frozen mud of the German borderlands. High above the forest floor, Corporal Jack Hayes crouched in the shattered rafters of a bombed factory in the Hürtgen Forest. Through the scope of his M1903 Springfield, he tracked two Wehrmacht runners sprinting between bunkers 380 yards downrange. This was the moment the United States Army had trained him for. The field manual was clear, its logic ironclad, developed in the static trenches of World War I. The doctrine demanded patience and precision above all else. Shoot the first target, chamber another round, reacquire. It was a rhythm drilled into every sniper at Camp Perry. One shot, one kill. The instructors had been adamant that speed gets you killed, while patience keeps you alive. But there was a fatal flaw in the manual, a disconnect between the classroom and the chaotic reality of the Hürtgen meat grinder. In the dense pines and steep ravines where visibility could drop to 30 yards, the enemy didn't stand still. The Germans knew the limitations of American bolt-action rifles, and they adapted by sending runners in pairs. Hayes knew exactly what would happen next if he followed orders. He had watched the standard doctrine fail 17 times in the last 3 weeks. He would drop the first man. He would work the bolt. But by the time he chambered a fresh round and brought his eye back to the scope, the second man would be gone. 17 escaped couriers, 17 bunkers warned, 17 ambushes set against American patrols. The cost of compliance was no longer theoretical. It was measured in the 23 men from his company who had died in a single ambush just days prior. Lives lost because an escaped runner had delivered the coordinates for a counterattack. Hayes sat on a charred beam, his finger resting outside the trigger guard. He was a long way from the steel mills of Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, where his grandfather had taught him to operate overhead cranes. But the lesson from the factory floor burned in his mind. Sometimes the machinery needs to be rigged differently than the manual specifies. Sometimes the manual is wrong. With the runners just 15 seconds away from the safety of concrete, Hayes made a decision that could lead to a court-martial by Christmas. He wasn't going to follow the procedure. He was going to rewrite it in real time. To understand why Jack Hayes was willing to risk a court-martial, you first have to understand the rigid, mechanical gospel preached at Camp Perry, Ohio. The instructors there were veterans of the Great War, men who had learned their trade in the static, mud-choked trenches of 1918. Their doctrine was simple, elegant, and totally unsuited for the Hürtgen Forest. It was called one shot, one kill. The logic went like this. Precision is paramount. Speed creates sloppy habits. Sergeant Ramirez, one of Hayes's instructors, repeated the mantra every morning. You take your target, you chamber another round, you reacquire. It was a deliberate 3-step waltz designed to conserve ammunition and maintain concealment. But in the winter of 1944, the Wehrmacht wasn't fighting a trench war. They were fighting a desperate mobile defense, and they had calculated the limitations of the American sniper just as coldly as they calculated artillery trajectories. The Germans knew that American doctrine dictated a specific sequence of movements that took time. Specifically, it took time that a sprinting man could use to survive. Hayes had done the math in the quiet darkness of a root cellar. A standard M1903 Springfield is a bolt-action rifle. To cycle the bolt, to unlock it, pull it back to eject the spent casing, and push it forward to chamber a new round took an average soldier 2.1 seconds if they were rushing. Then the sniper had to settle the stock back into his shoulder, find the scope's picture again, and reacquire a moving target. That took another 1.3 seconds. In a vacuum, 3 seconds is nothing. In combat, it is an eternity. A fit Wehrmacht courier, fueled by adrenaline and the fear of death, could cover 40 yards of ground in 3.4 seconds. In the dense pine woods of the Hürtgen, 40 yards was often the difference between being exposed in the open and vanishing behind a concrete bunker wall. This was the deadly mathematics of the second runner. The Germans had stopped sending individual couriers. They sent them in pairs. They knew that an American sniper following the manual would inevitably kill the first man. But while that sniper was locked in the 3.4-second ritual of cycling and reacquiring, the second man would cross the kill zone and deliver his message. The tipping point for Jack Hayes wasn't fear. It was frustration born of tragedy. On November 18, 1944, the deadly arithmetic of the battlefield finally balanced its books, and the cost was devastating. 6 hours after Hayes watched that second runner vanish into the tree line, having followed standard protocol to the letter, a German counterattack slammed into his company from an unexpected flank. The intelligence the escaped runner delivered allowed the Wehrmacht to hit with precision. 23 Americans died in the opening volley. Among them was Corporal Tommy Vincent, Hayes's spotter, who took shrapnel in the throat and bled out in the mud before medics could even attempt a rescue. Hayes couldn't prove in a court of law that the escaped runner caused the attack, but he knew it in his gut. The timing was too perfect. 4 days later, the nightmare repeated itself. Different location, same tactical failure. Hayes dropped the lead runner at 390 yards, but the standard bolt cycle was too slow to catch the second man. That night, a supply convoy was ambushed using fresh intelligence, leaving 7 more Americans dead. Hayes tried to go through the proper channels. He stood in a muddy command post that smelled of wet canvas and stale tobacco, pleading his case to Lieutenant Morrison. "Sir, the runners travel in pairs. By doctrine, I can only get one," Hayes argued. The response was a shrug from the thick-necked officer who didn't even look up from his maps. "Then get one. Better than none," Morrison said. When Hayes pressed, suggesting the technique needed adjustment, he was shut down with the coldest logic of the military bureaucracy. "The technique is fine. You follow doctrine. You do your job. You stay alive." Dismissed and disillusioned, Hayes returned to the rain-soaked forest. But the breaking point finally arrived on December 3rd. Working with a new spotter, a green kid from Oklahoma named Eddie Marsh, Hayes again engaged a pair of runners. He killed the first. He reacquired. The second was gone. That night, the Wehrmacht hit an American patrol with surgical precision, killing 9 men. Among the dead was Sergeant Bill Kowalski, the man who had taught Hayes half of what he knew about fieldcraft. Worse, Hayes had to watch Kowalski's younger brother receive the news. That was it. The manual said one thing, but the flag-draped coffins, metaphorical and literal, said another. Hayes realized he couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't follow a rule book written in 1918 while his friends died in 1944. If the Army wouldn't change the doctrine, he would have to break it. On the night of December the 4th, at 11:30 p.m., Jack Hayes sat alone in an abandoned root cellar that smelled of damp earth and decay. A single candle flickered on an ammunition crate, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. Before him lay his M1903 Springfield, disassembled on a wool blanket. To his spotter, Eddie Marsh, Hayes had claimed he was merely cleaning the weapon. That was only half true. He wasn't just maintaining the machine. He was reimagining how a human being was supposed to interface with it. Hayes's mind drifted back to Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, where the steel mills ran 24 hours a day, and the Allegheny River smelled of progress and sulfur. He thought of his grandfather, a man who had spent his life operating overhead cranes at Jones and Laughlin Steel. In the shadow of those smokestacks, Hayes had learned a fundamental truth about industrial work. Sometimes, to get the job done, you rig the machinery different than the manual says. His grandfather had been blunt about it. Sometimes the manual is wrong. The M1903 Springfield was a precise instrument designed for deliberate single-shot accuracy. The Army's manual treated it like a surgical tool. Fire, pause, lower the weapon to cycle the bolt, raise the weapon, reacquire the target, fire again. This process was safe, methodical, and painfully slow. But as Hayes ran his hands over the cold metal components, he realized the limitation wasn't mechanical. It was behavioral. The bolt mechanism itself was capable of rapid movement. The soldier had simply been trained to use it slowly. Hayes decided to apply the logic of the steel mill to the battlefield. He began to experiment with a technique that violated every safety protocol and marksmanship principle he had been taught at Camp Perry. The standard doctrine required breaking the cheek weld, lifting the head off the stock to cycle the bolt. Hayes realized this was the fatal error. Breaking the cheek weld meant losing the sight picture, which forced the sniper to waste precious precious seconds finding the target again. His new technique, Chiu, was a radical departure. He would fire, but instead of lowering the rifle, he would keep it mounted firmly in his shoulder. He would cycle the bolt with his right hand while his left hand maintained a death grip on the stock, keeping the scope's crosshairs aligned with the target area. He wouldn't wait to see if the first shot hit. He would trust his muscle memory to track where the second runner would be and fire immediately. It was a trade-off that would make a range instructor scream. The second shot wouldn't be as precise, but Hayes calculated that a 70% accurate shot taken in under 2 seconds was infinitely superior to a 95% accurate shot that never happened, because the target was already behind concrete. Alone in the cellar, Hayes practiced the motion 50 times. Fire, bolt, fire, fire, bolt, fire. His right hand learned to manipulate the steel action violently, while his head remained frozen against the wood stock. His hands smelled of gun oil and cold metal as he smoothed out the friction points. By 1:20 a.m., he reassembled the rifle. He had rigged the machinery. Now he just had to survive the test run. News travels faster than orders in a combat zone, especially when it involves survival. Private Marsh couldn't keep the impossible feat to himself. By evening, he had whispered the story to 3 other soldiers. By the next morning, the rumor had reached Corporal Davis and his spotter, Private Chen, the company's other sniper team. Davis was a wiry Tennessean, a man who treated the field manual like scripture and viewed improvisation with deep suspicion. When he confronted Hayes in the bombed factory, demanding to know how a bolt-action rifle could kill 2 men in under 2 seconds, his tone was accusatory. "That's not possible," Davis insisted. Hayes didn't argue. He simply demonstrated. He showed them the fire, bolt, fire rhythm, the unbroken cheek weld, and the reliance on muscle memory over visual confirmation. When Davis pointed out that the second shot was less accurate, Hayes countered with the brutal pragmatism of the front line. Doctrine loses the second runner every time. A less accurate shot that is fired beats a perfect shot that isn't. Davis tried it. On December 9th, he dropped 2 runners in 2.1 seconds. The rebellion spread underground, passed from sniper to sniper through whispered conversations and illicit demonstrations. Within a week, 8 American snipers in the Hürtgen Forest were using Hayes's technique. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't file reports. They simply stopped letting German couriers escape. The results were immediate and undeniable, creating a statistical anomaly that baffled the chain of command. Captain Weber, the battalion intelligence officer, stared at casualty reports in his command tent, noting that his unit was suddenly killing twice as many runners as before. "Maybe the boys are getting better shots," Lieutenant Morrison shrugged, unwilling to look a gift horse in the mouth. The Wehrmacht noticed, too. German officers, previously confident in their runner protocols, began puzzling over the sudden spike in courier deaths. Captured reports later revealed a recommendation that runners travel individually with 5-minute spacing, a tactical adjustment that slowed their communication to a crawl. In the frozen woods, a handful of tired men had fundamentally altered the battlefield dynamics, but in doing so, they had attracted the gaze of the very bureaucracy they were trying to bypass. Success, unfortunately, leaves a paper trail. In any large organization, competence eventually gets punished if it violates procedure. For Corporal Jack Hayes, the clock ran out on December 23rd, 1944. Captain Weber, the battalion intelligence officer, had finally pieced together why the kill counts were rising. He hadn't relied on reports. He had gone to the front lines. From a forward observation post, he watched through binoculars as Hayes executed a double-runner kill with that fluid, rapid-fire motion that simply shouldn't exist in American doctrine. Weber didn't congratulate the soldier. He initiated an investigation. Hayes was summoned to battalion headquarters, a reinforced bunker that smelled of diesel fuel and mildew. The atmosphere was heavy. Lieutenant Morrison was already there, looking visibly uncomfortable, caught between his loyalty to his men and his duty to his superiors. Weber didn't offer a seat. He went straight to the heart of the matter. "Corporal Hayes, demonstrate your bolt cycling technique," Weber ordered. Hayes knew the jig was up. He raised his invisible rifle, miming the fire position, the rapid bolt throw, and the immediate follow-up shot without breaking his stance. The room was silent. "That's not in sniper doctrine," Weber stated flatly. "No, sir," Hayes replied. "Did someone teach you this technique?" "No, sir. I developed it myself." When pressed for a reason, Hayes didn't apologize. He looked the captain in the eye and delivered the truth that no officer wanted to hear. "Because doctrine doesn't work against paired runners, sir. By the time we chamber and reacquire, the second target is gone." This was the clash of two worlds. To Hayes, the battlefield was a problem to be solved. To Weber, the Army was a machine that ran on standardization. "And you decided you knew better than United States Army doctrine?" Weber asked. "I decided I couldn't watch more men die, sir," Hayes answered. Lieutenant Morrison tried to interject, offering the only defense that should have mattered: results. "Sir, if I may, the technique has been effective. Runner kills are up 38% since Hayes started." Weber snapped back immediately. "That's not the point, Lieutenant. The point is that Corporal Hayes unilaterally modified established doctrine without authorization. That sets a dangerous precedent." Weber wasn't acting out of malice. He was acting out of a rigid belief in the chain of command. In his view, if every soldier decided which rules to follow, the Army would devolve into chaos. The fact that Hayes had taught the technique to others, Corporal Davis, Private Chen, and 6 more, made it a systemic infection rather than an individual error. When Morrison tried to argue that the technique saved lives, Weber threatened him with a court-martial as well. The argument was over. Captain Weber turned to the window, watching the snow fall on the Hürtgen Forest before delivering the verdict. "Corporal Hayes, you're confined to quarters pending formal charges. Court-martial board will convene after Christmas." The charges were heavy: conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, unauthorized modification of combat procedures, insubordination. Hayes walked out into the cold night. His spotter, Eddie Marsh, was waiting, looking stricken. "It's not your fault," Hayes told him before the kid could apologize. "You did the right thing." As he walked away to await his trial, Hayes muttered a final lesson that wasn't in the manual: sometimes the right thing gets you in trouble. The court-martial convened on December 28, 1944, in a requisitioned German schoolhouse 10 miles behind the front lines. The setting was stark. A chalkboard still hung on the wall, with Court Martial Board written in white chalk above 3 officers sitting in judgment. The prosecution's case was ruthlessly efficient. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan, the JAG officer, took just 15 minutes to dismantle Hayes's career. The facts were not in dispute. Hayes had violated doctrine. He had taught unauthorized techniques. He had undermined standardized training. 3 witnesses, including Lieutenant Morrison and a reluctant Private Marsh, confirmed the timeline. Captain Weber testified that while the results were notable, the act itself was insubordination that threatened the discipline of the entire battalion. Hayes, representing himself, offered no legal defense. He stood at attention, his uniform pressed, his boots polished. "Yes, sir," he answered when asked if he had broken the rules. He didn't beg for leniency, but the mood shifted when the presiding colonel from division headquarters leaned forward. He wasn't interested in the rule book. He was interested in the war. "Corporal Hayes, why did you develop this technique?" he asked. Hayes chose his words carefully. "Sir, under standard doctrine, we lose the second runner every time. Those runners carry intelligence that gets Americans killed." The colonel turned to Captain Weber, the man who had brought the charges. "Captain, what were runner casualties in your battalion before December 7th? Weber consulted his notes, his voice tight. "November average was 2.3 runners eliminated per week, sir." "And after December 7th? 8.4 per week, sir. That's a 367% increase." The colonel pressed harder. "And American casualties?" Weber flipped a page. "November average was 19 killed in action per week. December average is 12.3, sir." The room went silent as the colonel did the math. A 35% reduction in American deaths. He looked at Weber. "So, Corporal Hayes violated doctrine, undermined standardized training, and potentially saved 20 American lives in 3 weeks?" Weber had no answer. The deliberation took 40 minutes. When Hayes was called back inside, the verdict was delivered with military stiffness. Guilty of unauthorized modification of combat procedures and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Hayes expected the stockade. He expected a dishonorable discharge. Instead, the colonel delivered a sentence that was a masterclass in command logic. Reduction in rank to private. Forfeiture of 1 month's pay. Formal reprimand. Then came the salvation. "Furthermore, you are hereby assigned to Headquarters Company to develop a formal training program integrating your technique into sniper doctrine, effective immediately." Hayes stared, stunned. The colonel met his gaze. "You broke the rules, Private Hayes, but sometimes the rules need breaking." It was a paradox only the military could invent. Hayes was punished for being right, stripped of his rank for insubordination, and then ordered to teach the entire division how to be insubordinate just like him. Jack Hayes spent January of 1945 in a training facility in Belgium, doing the very thing he had been convicted for. He demonstrated the bolt cycle 8,000 times, teaching 63 snipers how to ignore the manual. He watched men struggle with the muscle memory until it clicked, smoothing out the mechanics of rebellion until they became the new standard. By March, the technique appeared in revised sniper training manuals. The Army called it field innovations developed during Hürtgen Forest operations. They did not call it the Hayes method. Hayes didn't care. He wasn't interested in credit. He was interested in results. Intelligence estimates later calculated that the technique contributed to 340 fewer American casualties across the European theater between December 1944 and May 1945. That was 340 men who went home to their families because a corporal from Pennsylvania refused to accept that the second runner had to escape. Hayes returned to combat in March 1945, stripped of his stripes, carrying his Springfield as a private once again. He fought through the Rhineland and into Bavaria, ending the war with 47 confirmed kills, 38 of them runners. When the guns finally fell silent, he cleaned his rifle one last time, turned it into the armory, and went home. He returned to Aliquippa and the steel mills, working the blast furnace just like his father. He married, raised 3 children, and never told them the details of what he had done. When asked, he would simply say, "I was a sniper. I did my job." There was only one ritual he kept. Every year on December 7th, the anniversary of the day he broke the rules, he received a phone call from Eddie Marsh. They talked for 20 minutes about the weather, baseball, or their kids. They never mentioned the runners, the Rafters, or the court-martial. They didn't have to. The date itself was the acknowledgement. Jack Hayes died in 1998 at the age of 73, his lungs finally giving out from years of mill smoke. His obituary in the Aliquippa Gazette gave him one paragraph: veteran of WWII, served with distinction. It mentioned nothing of the lives saved or the doctrine changed. But the legacy of Jack Hayes isn't written on a headstone or in a service record. It is written in the family trees of 340 men who survived the winter of 1944. It stands as a testament to a simple, powerful truth about warfare. Innovation doesn't come from committees or generals. It comes from tired men in bombed-out buildings who care more about saving their friends than saving their careers. Somewhere in Pennsylvania lies a man who saved a battalion by breaking every rule.